Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the final conversation in our series for the exhibition Tracked and Traced. My name is Antoine Scott, and I'm the head of programming and also a co-curator of the exhibition Tracked and Traced, which is a exploration of surveillance in society and takes a look at data and the technologies in which surveillance has influenced our lives. Today, I'm joined by one of my co-curators of the exhibition, Emily Wenger, who is a PhD student at the University of Chicago studying machine learning and security and privacy. She's particularly interested in understanding how preventing the unintended uses and abuses of facial recognition technology works. And I'm excited to be joined with her, and I will be turning over the panel to Emily. Emily, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Antoine. Before we get started, everyone, thanks for being here. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to each of our wonderful panelists, and then we'll jump right into the questions. So I'll start with Dr. Kovila Coopamootoo. She is a current professor at Newcastle University in the UK. So she's joining us from very late in the evening, but soon will be at King's College London starting in December. She researches user-centric privacy and security, which dovetails really interestingly with our topic of surveillance capitalism, because it deals with how users interact with and why they care about certain breaches of their privacy that might occur under a surveillance capitalism system. And in the past, she studied how privacy issues affect vulnerable groups like domestic violence survivors, which are another really interesting group affected by surveillance capitalism, and an area that we'll hopefully touch on today as well. Claire Garvey, one of our other panelists, is a senior associate at the Center for Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law School. She has a very particular and well-informed interest in facial recognition. So she's authored a number of really interesting and informative reports on facial recognition, especially on how police use facial recognition in America, and has written in numerous highly read publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and testified in Congress about these sorts of issues. So we're excited to hear from her today. And finally, Nick Feamster is a professor of computer science at the University of Chicago. He's also the director of the Center for Data and Computing here. And he has a very long and extensive history of research on different elements of computer networking and computer networking censorship in communication systems. So he has been around these topics for many years, and we are excited to have his expertise as well. So thank you all for being here. And to kick us off, I want to ask a very basic question, which is, how do you interpret this term surveillance capitalism, which our panel is focused on? What do you think of it? And how has your thinking on that topic evolved over time? Maybe I'll throw it to you first, Claire, and then people can jump in.
Great, very, very happy to be here. I think I come from an identity background, with face recognition being a form of identification. And so I also think of surveillance capitalism in sort of the privacy and identity framework. And what I mean by that is, one of the key goals of the aggregation of data is, in some ways, de-anonymization, is to understand who is in front of an ad, who is running a search, who is the person consuming information presented by a company. So it very much dovetails with this concept of de-anonymization. And within that framework, I think a lot about, okay, but what are our rights to anonymity? And what does anonymity protect within us? This is not just my internet search history or the fact that I might have a dog. It is what little pieces of information exist out there that create a generalized but highly specific picture, or general pieces of information that create a highly specific picture about who I am. And am I comfortable with that? Am I comfortable with that picture being created? And then the other aspect about that is, to what extent is the data collected and used about us? To what extent does that shape our experience of the world? Or more specifically, to what extent does it actually shape the world that we engage with? An example of this would be targeted advertising. What if I very consistently receive ads for subprime credit products? I start to think that my choice out there for credit products is just that universe. And so I'm not presented with the full range of choice or the types of other choices that people have. I'm not saying this very well. What I'm trying to say is the information that has been collected about us is used to then not only interpret who we are, to de-anonymize us, but then to present back to us a vision of the world that we engage with on a day-to-day basis, to the extent that we actually may not know the full range of choice that exists out there. Our choices are heavily defined by that information. So it's not, the data collection is not just a de-anonymization, but it's actually defining the world we live in, both online and increasingly offline.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. I think that the interesting thing about this concept is that it is, in a sense, a capitalistic driven thing. It's about making money, but in a sense, it also, because of the way the system is set up, it does limit our view of the world. So that's a really interesting perspective. What about you, Kovila? What's your take on this term and how do you think about it?
Yeah, so I think very much a lot of what Claire has already mentioned as well, and I would summarize it with targeted advertising and online behavioral advertising, and being presented a picture of the world that has been shaped by people's own online activities and behaviors online, and therefore I think it's really interesting if we think about it in a longitudinal fashion, like across someone's life, how their decisions and behaviors in their own line are affected by how they have been their activities online before. Mm-hmm. And also another way of thinking about it could be with regards to the technologies that enable such collection of data, such massive collection of data about individuals that are then used to data is the product. The data about people is the product now. And another aspect for me that is really scary as well is the aspect of how then, apart from providing consumers with products, how can that also be used by bad actors to perpetrators, for example, to target people specifically for harms and etc. So yeah, it's a fascinating topic and quite a exciting and dangerous area as well.
Yeah, and a broad one. There's a lot of things that fall under that umbrella that it's hard to almost encompass it in a single definition. Nick, did you have anything you want to add?
Sure, I think I agree with everything that Claire and Kovila have said thus far. Just to kind of add another dimension to it too. I think, if you think of this targeted advertising space, as a big part of surveillance capitalism, then a lot of basically what it's about is reducing uncertainty through modeling, right? It's like, well, I want to make sure that I show you ads that you're most likely to click through on or buy something from. Mm-hmm. But I use the word modeling, right? And so so basically it depends on good models, right? And what's the best model to reduce uncertainty? Nobody knows. And so absent omniscience, the basic fallback plan is just to collect more and more data, because nobody knows, is the fact that, a number of times I looked at my phone today, or did I walk or bike to work today, or, how many steps did I take, or what's my heart rate? Nobody really knows which of these features are, potentially there's a winner in there in terms of prediction of like, am I really going to buy that treadmill?
Mhm.
And so absent like basically knowing which features, produce the best models to reduce uncertainty, the answer is, well, like, let's just collect all of it. And then let's figure it out later. Or let's not figure it out. Let's just like throw it all into a giant like black box ML thing and hey, look, it works. And so the answer basically is like more data. And like, as we get more and more technology, right, it's easier to get more and more data of more and more types. And so you basically just in this spiral, like, hey, look, we can get this new kind of data from this device. Oh, cool. We got voice assistants. Oh, cool. We got, baby cameras. Oh, awesome. Like we can get data from that too. We don't know if it's useful, but we'll just figure that out later. And so I think that's sort of a big aspect, like driving on the data collection. The tech side is like, it's just easy to get the data. It's like pretty low cost. People also just give it away. I guess we'll talk about that. Mm-hmm. And then like nobody knows if it's useful, but because like nobody knows it isn't useful and it's cheap to get, then it's just like we basically just get more and more data, right? So
I think, thank you all. That's a helpful framing of our future conversation. And just a note to those of you who are listening, if you have questions or want to discuss something more, want to hear more about a particular area, please don't hesitate to put a message in the chat and I'll try to monitor that so I can adjust the conversation as needed. But so a common undercurrent of discussions around surveillance capitalism, I find, is that it is a bad thing. There's a presupposition that a lot of people go into this conversation about, which is that, oh, they're monitoring a lot of my data. Like, this must be bad. And numerous family members have pushed back on, to reveal a bias, like I do think this is a problem, but numerous family members have pushed back on me and said like, well, actually, like it's super helpful for, figuring out where I do want to go out to eat or figuring out what I do want to purchase with, this particular pot of money I have sitting around or whatever. So I want to hear from you guys, like, why should we care about this? Like, is it a bad thing that matters, or is it a helpful tool, or a mix of both? I'm curious what you guys think.
I think as a user-centric researcher, you've nailed it rightly, because a lot of our choices with regards to technology, we favor the fun or the convenience, and as you say, predicting what is going to be the best solution for myself or my family, etc. And in our research itself, in our various user-centric research, we have found that privacy is often traded off for convenience. Even safety, personal safety, is traded off for convenience or user-friendliness or fun, being the fact that it's fun. And anyway, a lot of technologies are often put out there for people to use in the real world before looking at the privacy or the safety issues of it, because it's so fun and convenient, right? It solves a problem. Just a little bit more on that. So in recent research that I've been conducting with regards to how people feel with regards to tracking and being profiled online. So a large percentage of them feel a lot of, those are people in the UK and Europe, they feel very negatively about it. But there are also those who are, they say like, I'm sometimes okay with it because it's so helpful, but sometimes I'm not okay with it. Or else they'll say like, I'm okay with it because I know I'm protected anyway, I take certain actions. Or they say, I'll be okay if this data was being used just to help me and not in a bad way. So there are all sorts of emotions, and I'm pretty sure that even like one person wouldn't have a fixed negative emotion all the time about tracking or being traced online. It will change according to the context and situations, as is usual with privacy anyway.
Which I think makes the question even more difficult, because if we ourselves don't have a constant opinion of the technology, it seems pretty hard to understand where the bounds are and what's okay and what's not.
I think one of the other questions to ask ourselves is, what happens if it gets it wrong? What are the consequences for it not being accurate? If the goal is precision about who a given person is, what are the consequences when it gets it wrong? Or what are the consequences when the technology behind a given system actually has no grounds in science and it's just guessing? I think about this with emotion detection. Basically, there are a lot of algorithms and companies out there that are seeking to be able to generate hints as to what somebody's thinking, their emotional state, or what they might do next. There isn't that much science behind these systems, and yet they are being incorporated into targeted advertising and security systems as well. What are the consequences of having no grounding in science? So basically just being a guess as to what somebody's feeling or what they might do next, or whether it gets it wrong. Do we have an avenue for redress if your data system consistently gives me higher prices than somebody else, or consistently thinks I'm a shoplifter and encourages me out of a store? Do I have an avenue to know that what's happening and how that's happening, and challenge it and get that information corrected?
Yeah, that makes sense. Nick, any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think Claire makes really good points here. I mean, I think, and I think actually everyone has made some very good points. I think one of the things that's tricky about this, I mean, you hit exactly on it, is that like actually some of this targeted prediction is useful.
Yeah.
And so I'm sort of basically drawn to, and we sort of sometimes try to frame some of the work that we've done in this space within the theory of privacy called contextual integrity, which some people are nodding, so maybe they've heard of this, but I'll poorly summarize it now, just in the instance of, in the interest of being concise, but it's basically like privacy isn't binary. People basically may be okay or not okay with their data being shared or exposed under certain conditions for certain people for a specific purpose. And so, for example, like, a few years ago, there was this whole blow up about Strava. We're both, we got some runners in the crowd here, right? And it's like, oh my gosh, Strava exposes your GPS data on the web to like other people. And it's, runners were like, yeah, that's like kind of the point. Right. But what I don't want is like that being shared with, law enforcement or Google or whatever, and so the tricky thing there is, and actually some people are like, oh yeah, do you know Strava like monetizes that? They sell it to cities. And I'm like, yeah, they do that actually so that they can do stuff like improve bike lanes, and figure out where to put like barriers for, pedestrians and stuff like that. And I'm like, that's good. I'm okay. Strava wants to make money, like doing stuff like that. I personally am okay with it. You might not be, right? Now, the thing is, like, we just don't have good frameworks and technologies, right? Or even, we've got nothing, right? We don't have regulations. We don't have technologies to say, well, here's what I'm okay with. Here's my data, but I want you to only use it for that, right? And I've got no way of like preventing it from being, used in other ways. I also have no way of auditing to figure out that it's not being used in other ways, right? But I think it's certainly what you said is indisputable. I think it's that's the tricky part, is that it is actually useful in some cases, and in certain cases we might be actually okay with companies making money doing things that we're okay with. We hear about all the bad stuff, right? That's the stuff people get fired up about. It's not all bad. We just have to figure out how to keep the good uses from bleeding over into the bad uses. I think that's actually super hard, super hard, because a lot of it we can't see. Right?
Yeah, it's hidden behind a lot of different layers of complexity and obfuscation, which is tough. I'm curious, you said that it's impossible to set like a boundary of when it can and can't be used. Like, I think about maybe as a counterexample to that, although this is imperfect, is the new requirements under the EU's GDPR regulation, which, for example, requires a website to present to you which cookies it's tracking you on and allowing you to opt in or out. Do you think there's, in the realm of possibilities, a way to do that at a broader scale for different types of data? Or do you think that is too complex of a problem to even begin to tackle?
that's a question for me, right? Like, I think
it's for you, but if others, yes, others.
I'll start and then maybe kick it to the other panelists. I'm going to sort of say that's, so I shouldn't use the word impossible. I think nothing is ever impossible. We got to work on it, but it's very hard. To the cookie thing too. I mean, that's, it's a good example that you brought up. I'm kind of skeptical about, about all of that theater, frankly, because, there's something called, cookie syncing. And I don't know how many people are, like Emily's nodding, but I don't know how many others are familiar with this. So you can delete all of your cookies. Okay. For those of you who I assume this audience is familiar with cookies and tracking, but you can delete all of your cookies and you can say, oh, I don't want this website to put them there. But there are other technologies like browser fingerprinting. So for example, like the particular version of the browser that I'm using, the fonts that I have installed, the size of my browser window, et cetera. Those, you put a bunch of those things together and they're like unique to me, actually. So if anyone who wants to learn more about this should just look up web browser fingerprinting. And so the gist of it is you can delete all your cookies, but someone knows you're back and they just basically put the cookie right back in. And not only that, two sites can figure out that it's you and they can do something called cookie syncing and basically just not only put them back, but they can link them together. And so, I kind of think the cookie deletion thing is a little bit of a theater. Sorry to be dark, but
it's dark, but that's okay.
But I think like there's a broader lesson there too, which is that like, I think there's really a lot that regulation can do, right? I mean, I think that certainly regulation is super important in this space, but also I think we have to be really eyes open about the limitations of regulation. So when we talk about, all this cookie stuff, it's like, cool, that maybe puts up a wall this high. Someone can still jump over it. So
they work a little harder, but they're still.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
I want to expand a bit on the limitations of regulations that Nick has just mentioned. So in our own research and other research in the area, we talk about something called dark patterns, and in particular with regards to the cookie notices and whether the regulation is being applied in an ethical way, for example. And so what we find is that it's so much easier for people to just click accept to cookies, whereas it's more difficult and you need to actually make more clicks to not accept or even change your cookie settings afterwards. It's practically impossible. And so even though we have these regulations in Europe, it is a mess at the moment to actually regulate it in online technologies. So I just wanted to drop that in.
Yeah, that is tricky. I wanted to take a little bit of a detour. Claire, something you had mentioned, I think it was in an email exchange we had earlier, was about this connection between online and offline. Because certainly, you're online, you're using a browser, there are cookies, you're being tracked around the internet. But I think another perhaps less discussed aspect of this surveillance capitalism or, tracking model is that there can be connections between what you do in the real world and what you do online. And you mentioned that this was of interest to you, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about how this works and the sort of implications it has for our privacy.
Yeah, so I have so many thoughts on this. I write almost exclusively about face recognition, but something that's top of mind to me is how we conceive of privacy in the online world and the relationship between that and what we do offline in two ways. One is how our online persona and activity follows us into the offline world, but also how our offline interaction with ads and whatnot can actually influence our experience of the world, as I was mentioning before. So in the online space, I think a lot about this presumption of privacy, and I think some of our audience members are on the younger end of the spectrum. People 25 and under have never had the opportunity not to live online through no real choice of their own. So this is a demographic that should care deeply about the concept of privacy on the internet, because it's never not existed for them, that online persona. And I think A lot of older privacy folks will talk about, oh, like the young kids don't care about privacy. I think that's not true. They've just never not lived on the internet, and B, have found very clever and innovative ways to compensate for that and to express their own privacy. Nick was just mentioning the idea of different audiences, the idea of having different social media accounts depending on who they care about, knowing or not knowing certain pieces of information. Do you have a persona for your close friends, and then your Twitter account that your parents know about, and the one that your school knows about, and then the one that only your closest friends know about? It's the same thing that we do in the offline space. I know this is not a talk about face recognition, but I would argue that the introduction of face recognition, especially what the company Clearview AI is doing with web scraping, now 10 billion images from the web, that's more than the population of the world, means that these segmented personas that we have historically been able to have on the internet can all of a sudden be connected, because having your face online is such a common way to express ourselves and engage. And the idea that, me getting caught in the, somebody else's photo at a gay bar, let's say, can now be connected back to my identity. Imagine if, moving back to the offline world, imagine if I don't know, have a very conservative family. Does that have consequences for me? What does it mean to protect our privacy on the web, and how do those breaches of privacy, how can they affect us in the real world? I think it happens, and it happens particularly for historically marginalized individuals, people who are subject to marginalization or discrimination based on some of their identities that they may be very careful to protect in the online world from other people, online and offline. And we see companies sort of not respecting that, and regulation not conceiving of what is the appropriate barriers to put in place to protect those really important privacy protective lines in the online space.
Yeah, it seems like the boundaries are porous, and I think they only become more porous, as you said. Facial recognition becomes increasingly prevalent in the offline world, but can connect to our online profiles. I think also I have been doing research on like voice recognition recently, and that's a connection too, because people can take your Instagram stories or whatever and take the voice snippets and use that to connect perhaps your Alexa activity or things like that. So there's all these porous boundaries. And I think especially your point about marginalized groups being most affected by this boundary, I think is very true. I know, Kovila, your research has previously touched on the effects of online privacy and domestic violence and those connections. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about those sorts of effects and how that ties in here.
Yeah, sure. And so I think the few aspects in relation to vulnerable communities, including violence survivors, was a few years ago we tried to devise or develop technologies to protect people who are in intimate partner violence situation. And we were like, those privacy technologies that one could have on their phone would actually raise an alarm that would put those vulnerable people more at risk. And so we were trying to work with communities and see what are their actual real experiences, real life experiences, so offline life, that might actually impact how those technology needs to be designed. And with regards to other marginalized communities, so we are looking at older adults and more recently at teenagers, how they perceive kind of deceptive practices online. How do they detect whether a website, for example, is encouraging them to release more information or share about others, for example. And what else have we been doing? So in terms of I'll talk a bit more about the protective technologies rather than general technologies. So one of the things we are very interested in is how protective technologies have naturally been designed for the kind of the general population, and not those who are specifically vulnerable. And in that way, for example, those vulnerable may not have access to protective technologies. They might not know how to use them. They might be more concerned in a situation, and those technologies might put them more at risk, for example. And they might just have different needs, different life needs that makes it not suitable for them. And I think those aspects are really important when we want to design inclusive technologies. I mean, if we go even broader, in the recent tracking research that I did, we actually found a difference between how men and women, general men and women who are very educated and skilled technologically, how they protect their privacy online against tracking differently. So women tend to be very more concerned and feel violated even, but their use of protective technology is weaker in a way. So I think that's an interesting interesting area of research. And a lot of research has focused on cisgender men and women. I think we need to go beyond those kind of boundaries, if we call them, or binary distinctions between people, etc. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of actually designing protective technologies that fit people's real life situations in a protective way rather than putting them more at risk.
Yeah, that makes sense. Nick, I know you've done a lot of research on the digital divide, which sort of touches on this topic, the idea that, there are people who are and aren't able to access technology and how that impacts their lives. And I'm curious what your take is on this conversation in light of that.
Thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, I mean, that was a pro segue right there, because I was just about to say this is a little bit out of this what Kovila and Claire have been talking about is a little bit out of my realm, but in my work, I work in computer networking, for those of the audience who are not familiar with that, and so some of what we do involves measuring the performance of the internet and its support for various applications in underserved communities. And some of that work involves interacting with members of the community directly, community-based organizations, citizens in the community, and so forth. And basically what Claire and Kovila have been saying is pretty much echoes what I often hear, which is like, okay, cool. First, we need internet access, but also people don't know how to use the internet. People do not understand like that when they log onto Facebook or, whatever, not to single out Facebook, but that is certainly one that, has been mentioned specifically, that they're giving up XYZ, about their privacy. They have basically no filter, right? And people are not essentially educated about that. And, again, I don't work in this area, so I hesitate to draw like broad conclusions. But certainly I've heard about research that talks about how, underserved neighborhoods, communities of color, et cetera, are disproportionately, shall we say, vulnerable to invasive privacy technology. Because they're just not aware, and certainly anecdotally, I've seen that in some of my work, and it's worrisome. Actually, it strikes me as it's very real.
Yeah, and it can be predatory, and it can be damaging, like Claire was mentioning at the very beginning about how, specifically in the line of targeted advertising, if a model gets a view of you that is a very particular view, it limits what the scope of things you're able to see through those sorts of things. And then that perhaps limits your ability to interact fully with the online world. So I'm curious, thinking maybe more broadly, and maybe thinking more specifically about the use of like online surveillance and less the connection to offline. What do you think it would take for the status quo on this to change? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of noise right now about online privacy and preserving that better. For example, Facebook just announced that they deleted, all their face templates, which I'm sure, Claire, you have thoughts on that, but, and they got rid of their facial recognition. So there's a shift around privacy, and it seems like a movement to try and limit these abuses, but going is slow. And I'm curious what you guys think it would take to actually get momentum on this.
I'm happy to start. As a user-centric researcher and very user-pro and like kind of focused on users, I would say it's not a user problem at all. It's everybody's problem, all the stakeholders involved. Like, what should designers need to be doing to kind of relate more to people's concern and linking protective actions to their concerns and feelings, because we notice a gap between how people feel very bad about certain things or feel okay, and then how they should be protecting themselves. There is kind of some ladders, like some steps to be taken to get there, like to recognize that this technology is useful for what I need, how to use it, in what context to use it, etc. Mm-hmm. And for users themselves, they would probably want to be educated on like protective browsers, for example, browsers that are designed for privacy specifically. So very specific solution. And how do we get those users to be educated in that way? And then there's this idea, like we're saying, there are different groups of communities or users with so diversity in a way, right? People have diverse characteristics that make them more vulnerable or less vulnerable. Mm-hmm. How do we then protect according to these different diversity markers? And for regulators as well, how could they make sure, I don't know if it's guidelines or recommendations, to ensure that those service providers, those providing the websites or services, are not employing deceptive patterns, or as we call them, dark patterns, to get people to do what they don't want to be doing online and not realizing what they're doing, right? Yeah. And the other group of people, researchers, have a lot to do, I think, in terms of connecting how people are feeling with or concerned about with how to get to actually acting mm-hmm. in a productive way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think two of the, just to echo what Kovila was saying, stop putting the responsibility on an individual person to protect their privacy. That's crazy. An individual person, I think of myself as pretty highly educated. I'm not technically minded, but I work in privacy and technology on the legal side. I don't understand what these user agreements mean. I don't understand the difference between a cookie and if I reject that kind of tracking, whether there are other forms of tracking. Mm-hmm. Why is it up to me to mm-hmm. understand all of that and make that choice? Mm-hmm. Which brings me to the second point. What is meaningful choice? And are we giving the end user meaningful choice, or are we essentially coerced by dint of needing to use the internet mm-hmm. and access news articles and use Gmail or our email provider? Are we do we essentially not have a choice in opting in, if you will, to certain types of tracking and data collection? Mm-hmm. I bridle every time I hear, well, it's like we accept these terms of service. I click sometimes, accept cookies, but not because I want those cookies, not because I'm okay with it, but because I really need to read the article that's underneath that pop-up. Yeah. I would not say that's me very clearly choosing one thing over the other. That's me just trying to navigate the internet. Yeah. And then the last thing I'll say is we think about, in contract law, I come to this as a lawyer, we have not just the source of data being the individual, but if we think of who the system is used on. Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a contract created between a company or a data broker mm-hmm. and let's say a data broker and an advertiser. That's who has those are the two parties that have agency and mm-hmm. sign the contract. But the person affected by that relationship is us, is a third party that has no agency, no transparency, we're not a legal entity with that contract. Or surveillance company, let's say face recognition company, and retail outlet signs a contract, but then uses this device on us, on a third party. Again, we have no transparency or agency in that legal document. And I think it would be a fundamental shift in how we think about contracting and the law, but to somehow give the individual, to not put responsibility on that individual, but to give them some sort of grant of agency or consideration in that type of contract if we are the ones on which the technology is used.
Yeah. I feel like, I'm pretty privacy conscious, but at the same time, like I want to use the internet. So I give my email address or whatever. And I feel like I'm a huge Harry Potter fan. So I feel like I'm leaving like little Horcruxes of my identity, like around the internet. And like somebody could definitely, reconstruct all of who I am based on all the websites that have my email address. And it's so frustrating, but like you said, it feels so unavoidable because we are very, like it's dehumanizing almost. We're not treated as a human. We're treated as like a piece of data to get a click, Nick, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I really have enjoyed what's been said so far in response to the question. And I mean, I might end up kicking it back over to Claire as a legal expert, because I feel like, the title of the panel being surveillance capitalism, and your question being, is it going to get any better? You sort of you reference Facebook's facial recognition walk back. Well, I don't know, maybe I'm a technologist, so I'm speaking as a citizen here, not as an expert, but my cynicism there is that, well, they probably decided that there was more money to be made, or avoid, less money to be lost, by walking that back in the current climate, than there was to be made by continuing to go down that road, and I mean, again, I don't want to pick on Facebook. I feel like I'm picking on Facebook, but Facebook is pretty famous for basically walking something back at some point and then basically turning right back around 2 years later and saying like, yeah, okay, actually we are going to do that. And so I'm again, I don't want to be too cynical or dark here, but I don't think that that's like a trend. And I think like, how is it going to get better? I think the title of the panel is a great answer to that. It's like, the only way to make it better is to basically well, maybe not the only way. One way to make it better is to make it not profitable to do that. And I actually don't know how you do that. Like, at least in the context of United States law, it strikes me that the FTC's capacity to enforce this stuff is pretty weak. I mean, that's a question for Claire, really, but it strikes me that like it's going to continue as long as people can make money on it, and it's not like bound by enforceable regulation. Like, you can't just have regulation; it has to also be enforceable, right? And so you can't just say don't do that if nobody can enforce it, or if it's too costly to enforce it. Then you can fine Facebook like $1 million or $10 million or whatever, but that's not going to change anything. So I don't know.
I think about that sometimes, like what would shift the economic incentives? Because really it comes down to it. People found out you make money doing this, so they made money doing it. And you need a whole new model.
I sort of feel like I kind of walked over into Claire's expertise there, in the legal realm, because it just seems to me like that some of the answer there has to be, regulatory, because, there's going to be money to be made from the tech, like, as has been proven. And so I don't know. I feel like the answer is it's not going to get totally better by fixing the tech. That's for sure.
Claire, what do you think?
I unfortunately have to echo the skepticism. What we're seeing in the face recognition realm, it's not just Facebook that's walked away from face recognition. It's about Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft all committed to not selling to law enforcement. Well, they don't really sell to law enforcement. So it sounded great. But you know who it sounded really good to? It sounded really good to the companies that supply face recognition systems to law enforcement, like NEC and IDEMIA and Gemalto and DataWorks Plus and Rank One Computing. Those didn't walk back from supplying these systems, but those are the ones that are in the space. So I think we should be, I think it's appropriate to be skeptical when we see a company apparently acting against their own self-interest. Is it actually their self-interest, or have they made a calculated choice that these are the way the winds are blowing and they aren't losing that much by signaling their pro-privacy stance? Now, there are exceptions to that. One of the first and very inspiring experiences I had working with the Center on Privacy and Technology is working with a bunch of faith-based and privacy advocacy groups around AdWords, and that the Google AdWords would support payday lending ads. So one could type into Google, I need money for rent. And the first 3 or 4 things that would show up would be AdWords advertisements for payday loans with APRs of, I don't know, 12,000%. This is worse than what like Al Capone would charge. And Google committed to walking that back. That probably hit them financially. Yeah. But it was a choice that, when presented by hundreds of organizations, seemed like the unequivocally correct choice. So there's grounds for optimism, but there is unfortunately far more grounds for skepticism too.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of really large system level change that's needed. But maybe, since we only have a few minutes left, and in hopes of bringing some more like practical and perhaps hopeful advice to the audience, given that the primary audience here is 15 to 25, have always lived online, and in light of your expertise about this area, what do you guys think is some good practical, maybe unconventional advice for thinking about protecting your privacy online and sort of trying in your own small way, although it shouldn't be on your shoulders, to push back against this kind of a system? I'll maybe throw it to you, Nick, and then we can go around.
I was waiting for Kovila, because we're basically like putting all the onus on the user, right? So
that's true.
Kovila's got all the answers. But actually, I was thinking a little bit about it too, and it's, as I think everybody on the panel has said, it's actually pretty super hard when you're using technology to sort of mediate how data is collected about you. Yeah. And so I don't really, we can kind of like go deep into like some technical stuff. Like we've worked on traffic padding and various forms of obfuscation. And I think going back to the beginning, we're working now on like, are there ways that you could tie a contextual integrity framework into data collection and modeling, so that if a user could say like, here are my preferences on how I want this to be used, could something like that be enforced and audited? And so like, as a technologist, I feel like, those are good things to be working on, but I'm also like very eyes open as to like, well, that's not going to totally solve it. Yeah. That maybe makes things a little better. And so I was actually thinking about, what I do, because your question was really about like, what can we do? Like, what can we do today? So what do I do? And again, this is me as a citizen, not as like necessarily an expert, but I actually, I'll reference another Georgetown faculty member, actually. It's Cal Newport. He's written some nice books on various things. He wrote Deep Work, and I'm not getting paid for this, this is not affiliate marketing, right? This is the right panel for that, right? But he has a book called Digital Minimalism, which I kind of try to abide by. He's got a really interesting principle in there that says like, hey, do you really want to use that technology? And it's not like, oh, that technology is kind of useful. It's kind of, it's kind of good. Maybe I'll use it. It's like, is that the best tech tool for the thing that you're trying to do versus like something else? Not just like, is it good, but is it like the best way of doing what you want to do? So for example, like I'm trying to get the message out that I'm on a surveillance capitalism panel today. Like, well, I could do a Medium post, or I could like do Twitter, or I could like post on Facebook, or I could like talk to my department, PR people and have them. And so I start to think about like, well, do I really need to be on Twitter, like doing X, Y, and Z? And so I've tried as an individual, I've tried to kind of mediate my use. And I found his principles in the Digital Minimalism book to be useful. He's really, more about like, how do I not get so tied up and wrapped in and addicted to tech? But I think that principle is kind of useful for privacy as well. So that's something that I do. But again, that's not my research. That's just me.
No, that's great. Thank you. What about you, Kovila? This is your research. What thoughts do you have?
So one thought I had, again, following what our participants were saying in one of our studies, because we wanted to know, how do they learn about how to protect themselves, whatever ways, whether it's, deciding to give fake information or using different non-technology strategies versus using protective technology as strategy. Mm-hmm. And so quite a large percentage say they go and do their own research. But another huge percentage say, I ask my family and friends and people who care about me or I care about. So how would it be if we could kind of engage or enable those communities to support each other online and to talk about it? Like, we have influencers for a lot of things. Why not about how to protect yourself and be a private, responsible citizen, or while not having to wear the burden, obviously, but having this support. I think having kind of collective support or support from people we trust or care about, who care about us, is really important, because as we have been discussing today, it's very difficult for a single individual user alone. So I think social support would be fantastic, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
and
that'd be awesome.
Support.
Thank you. Claire,
and,
any final
sorry, and obviously, sorry,
Yeah.
I just want to say social and community support, it has to be good advice, obviously. It shouldn't be like, digging our own grave again. Anyway.
Yeah, good point.
I really like that point.
Mm-hmm.
I think going back to what I do personally, I hesitate to give this advice, but I do think this is from some sort of the cynical side of me, is be comfortable with who you are in every space. Think before you tweet. Sounds really trite. My boss right now, Alvaro Bedoya, has been nominated for Federal Trade Commission chair. Every single one of his tweets is being read and examined to see whether there's anything there that somehow disqualifies him or can be taken out of context to challenge that nomination before he goes before Congress. Be comfortable with, let's be real, that nude photo you sent, it could leak, but that's not on you. Live your life, but be comfortable with how you're living it. But I would love to, that's very cynical. So let's end on Kovila's note about looking out for each other, because there are things that we can do. Before you post a picture of your friend to the internet, are they comfortable with their face up there? Or do they have considerations about being vulnerable to stalking that you may not be aware of? If you're at a protest taking photos, obscure those faces, because that could be used to prosecute. Think about how you're affecting others' safety and privacy online as well. We have to look out for each other.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. Thanks so much, everyone, for your time. Thanks for your thoughts and your insights. Really appreciate it. And I think this conversation will be available online, so people can go back and watch it. And before we end, I just want to also thank the sponsors of this conversation, the Michigan State University Federal Credit Union and the Tracked and Traced exhibit at Science Gallery Detroit. It's been an honor and a privilege to talk to you all, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.